Are you questioning the contradictions, extremism, or social control dominating the left? If so, you're not alone. Welcome to The Mirror, a podcast where questioning leftists step out of the echo chamber to explore the insights hidden in blacklisted books and the minds of so-called heretics. This podcast is about finding the courage to move beyond identity politics, embrace self-reflection, and ask tough questions to foster growth and free thought. If you've ever felt uneasy with the prescribed moral dogma and are ready to challenge your beliefs, you're in the right place. I'm Amelia Carter, and I'll be your host alongside Elías Gonzalez.
Hey y'all, I'm Elías, and I couldn't be more excited to take this journey with you, Amelia, and with our listeners. So, in each episode, we're going to dive into media, literature, and personal stories that unpack critical theory and social justice ethos, which have shaped not just our worldview, but so much of the mainstream culture today. Together, we're going to confront suppressed realities, rethink long-held beliefs, and peer deeper into the mirror to uncover truths that challenge comfort.
The Mirror isn't just a podcast, it's also an online discussion group. It's a space to step outside of the bubbles we've built around ourselves and dive into perspectives that challenge the way we see things. Each week, we tackle topics central to the left, exploring research and arguments that push us to think differently. Our goal is to confront the blind spots we've noticed in ourselves and help rebuild a culture of free speech and self-awareness. If this resonates with you, join the conversation by applying to our Google form.
Amelia, do you mind letting people know why we're asking them to apply versus just sign up?
Yeah, so I think as someone coming from a community organizing background, I was definitely in the culture of having things be very open to the public and very collectivist, but my thinking on that has changed, especially as it relates to this subject. And this really comes down to the culture of shutting down free speech on the left. The truth is that people are too intimidated to have open conversations or even read certain books because they've seen people be harassed and canceled for doing so. So that's why I think it's so important to keep spaces like this protected from abuse. And we also had to screen people because it was clear that some people were applying without having read what the group actually is about. So if it seems like you don't understand the purpose of the group and what we're really here trying to achieve, then we'll have to decide ahead of time that it's not the right fit for you.
Before we get started, we'll be diving into a lot of terms that can get confusing. So let's break down a few of them now. Postmodernism is a philosophy that emerged in the mid-20th century. Postmodernism challenges the idea of universal truths, objectivity, and fixed meanings. Instead, it believes knowledge and reality is shaped by power dynamics and social constructs. It's skeptical of grand narratives and focuses on deconstructing traditional structures and norms. The material we discuss on this episode will talk a lot of the influences of postmodernism on academia and our understanding of the world today. Marxism is a political and economic theory developed by Karl Marx, which argues that society is defined by class struggle between the oppressors, or the bourgeoisie, and the oppressed, or the proletariat. It aims to create a classless, equitable society through the redistribution of power, wealth, and material resources. As you will see, Marxism has heavily influenced leftist politics. We are just introducing the concepts today, but we'll get much deeper into these subjects in future episodes.
Critical theory is a framework created by blending postmodernism and Marxism. It is the foundation for all grievance studies fields. The key idea is to critique and dismantle societal structures seen as perpetuating oppression, often focusing on power dynamics and systemic inequality. Grievance studies are academic fields rooted in critical theory. These fields prioritize lived experience and focus on uncovering oppression in society through the lens of identity-based grievances.
Critical race theory is a framework within Grievance Studies that examines how race and racism are embedded in societal systems and institutions. The main idea is that racism is systematic, not just individual, and must be addressed by fundamentally transforming those systems. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, is a set of programs and policies that put critical race theory into practice. Its goal is to push ideas like diversity of identity, enforce equity of outcomes, and so-called inclusive practices into institutions.
We also wanted to dive into some tricky terms like equity and equality. Equality is about giving everyone the same opportunities, while equity focuses on achieving equal outcomes by redistributing resources or advantages to address perceived imbalances. Essentially, equity means shifting resources from some groups to others to create what's considered a fair or just balance. We use terms like liberal, leftist, and woke pretty loosely, sometimes even interchangeably, because we're human and life doesn't always fit into strict definitions and categories. Looking back, I can see how my political identity and behavior shifted over time, depending on where I was in life or the context I was in. There were times I was more liberal, other times leftist, and even moments where I leaned woke. But most of the time, I didn't realize when those changes were happening, and I certainly wouldn't have admitted to being woke. So that being said, these terms aren't perfect, and neither is our use of them, but these loose definitions can help clarify things. When we use the word liberal, we're generally referring to a center-left politic. It's about focusing on social programs and equal opportunities, emphasizing personal freedoms, social equality, and gradual government-led reforms. Leftism goes further, zeroing in on systemic inequality and pushing for radical changes to address power imbalances. Leftists often see liberal approaches as too slow or superficial. Woke takes things even further. Rooted in critical theories, it shifts the focus from equality to equity, aiming to dismantle power structures in a way that feels almost revolutionary. It often emphasizes identity politics and lived experience as the ultimate authority, viewing the world through the lens of oppression and privilege.
Now we're going to dive into the material and conversations we've had in our first two discussion group meetings. We started our discussion by exploring the Reformers documentary by Michael Nayna, which takes us inside the chaotic 2017 student uprising at Evergreen State College and the 2018 Grievance Studies Affair. From there, we explored Cynical Theories by Helen, Pluckrose, and James Lindsay, a book that delves into the ideological roots of the social justice activism prevalent on college campuses like Evergreen.
The film starts with Evergreen's efforts to transform their already highly liberal college into a deliberately anti-racist and equitable environment. Their approach involved creating an equity council backed by the administration and guided by critical race theory principles. Diversity, equity, and inclusion programs became the tools for driving these changes through both top-down and student-led initiatives. But these programs, which were rooted in racial division and ideological conformity, ended up tearing the campus apart.
These changes culminated in the Day of Absence. Historically, this student initiative involved Black students and faculty voluntarily absenting themselves to highlight their contributions to campus life. But in 2017, under the new anti-racist framework, white students and faculty were required to leave campus.
When biology professor Brett Weinstein objected, calling the plan coercive and discriminatory, he became the scapegoat for student activists. They accused him of racism, tried to get him fired, and used his public persecution to intimidate others into submission. The administration offered no protection, even telling local police to stand down as mobs of students hunted him on campus.
Do you know that there are people outside that door chanting for you to be fired?
We would like to reach out to students of color in the humanities as well as sciences that we are here to support. We want to dismantle anti-Blackness campus wide. We want to give some sense of solidarity and provide safety and outside our lives.
Will you listen to me?
Yeah.
Okay. No, not me. Please.
No,
Go!
Okay. I am committed to equity. I'm as committed, I believe, as anyone on this campus. I happen to disagree with other folks on this campus about the way there, okay? But I'm not an unreasonable person. I'm not uninterested. I'm not uninformed about history. I know the implications of these things.
Hey, hey! Ho, ho! Red, white, team, Nazi, ho! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! Red, white,
Oh my God! Listen to me. Yes, I know. And history could pivot in the direction of the values that you are standing here for.
Yeah, resign.
What?
Resign.
I'm not resigning.
Okay.
If I owe an apology, I will deliver it.
This wasn't activism. It was ideological warfare. Students barricaded the library, created hostage-like situations, and extorted the college, demanding reparations, free meals, and academic leniency. Faculty, terrified of being labeled not anti-racist enough, turned on each other to prove their allegiance, falsely accusing their peers of bigotry in an act of shameless self-preservation. The campus became a battleground of paranoia and abuse, leaving careers and relationships in ruins.
This is all security right now. Students are taking furniture and putting it in front of the doors to block police from coming inside.
Watching the film, I couldn't help but think about the racial justice protests of the 1960s that swept through universities across the U.S. Those movements, now celebrated and commemorated with murals and plaques on campuses, used similar tactics like occupying buildings and shutting down operations. Those students were also pushing for systemic changes, including the development of grievance-based academic programs, like the ones we're discussing today. In The Reformers, I remember there was literally a scene where a faculty member who had been held hostage by one of the student activists was groveling for their approval, and one of the students calls her disgusting, first of all, and then lashes out at her and says, "Wasn't it you who taught us how to do this?"
I would like to go now, but I also don't want to offend anyone by walking out. So would it be okay if some of us walk over?
The fact that you're even afraid of offending somebody by leaving to go and support the students in which you all are here to serve is laughable to me. It's embarrassing. It's sad. It's disgusting. That's what your job is to do, is to educate us. Didn't you educate us on how to do like this? It was you that taught us that in class. All right, though?
It really just makes me think about how protest is romanticized and how desperate students and professors, I think, are to feel a part of history and to feel like they are a reflection of their radical politics. It also makes me really question the things that we're asking for and if they're paying off. Like this entire campus, all of the faculty champion this exact kind of behavior of the past. They romanticize it and they feed it to the students as something to strive for. And then when it was happening to them, it really makes you see the flaws that undergird this type of way of seeing the world, this type of behavior. And I don't know, just seeing this for the first time is, I know for a fact, the thing that made me really want to dig deeper. It's like, this is really confronting to me because I myself also romanticize this kind of behavior. So what is it that isn't sitting right? What is really wrong with what they're doing and what they're asking for? Aren't these all the same things that the activists from the 1960s, which I romanticize, also did? And let me tell you, when I started looking into it, I really did not like the answers that I was finding.
Insanity. I think it's worth keeping in mind the parallels between the activism of the 60s and today's woke social justice movements as we move forward. You know, in later sessions, we're going to dive deeper into a critical history of civil rights and Black liberation movements to uncover these roots that inform us about today's activist culture. Back to the film. In response to the rising extremism and ideological incoherence in academia, as seen in cases like Evergreen, liberal intellectuals James Lindsay, Peter Boghossian, and Helen Pluckrose launched the Grievance Studies Affair. By successfully submitting intentionally ludicrous papers mimicking critical theory, they exposed how many academic journals prioritize ideological conformity over scholarly rigor.
Dear Dr. Helen Wilson, I have now closely considered the revisions of your manuscript, Dog Park, and will recommend its publication in Gender, Place, and Culture. You have done very good work to address the issues the reviewers raised and have clarified your arguments. Thank you for your contribution to Gender, Place, and Culture, and I hope to be seeing your manuscript in print. Yours truly, PhD, Managing Editor, Gender, Place, and Culture. We have an accepted paper in the #1 feminist geography journal.
Since approximately June of 2017, I, along with two other concerned academics, Peter Boghossian and Helen Pluckrose, have been writing intentionally broken academic papers and submitting them to highly respected journals in fields that study gender, race, sexuality, and similar topics. We did this to expose a political corruption that's taken hold of the university. By this point, several of these papers have been accepted in highly respected journals, and one that claims that dog humping incidents can be taken as evidence of rape culture has been officially honored as excellent scholarship.
We have to talk about some of these hoax papers that were actually accepted into real academic journals. They are brilliant and unbelievable and hilarious. So the first one argued that straight men could fight transphobia by wearing butt plugs. Of course, that was published in a gender and sexuality studies journal. Another one claimed that gaining weight could be reframed as radical bodybuilding and an act of resistance against societal norms. That was published in a fat studies journal. And the wildest one took sections of Mein Kampf and refashioned them with feminist theory, replacing Jews with men as the oppressors and reframing women as the superior class. This one was published in a freaking social work journal. Although it's easy to laugh at how ridiculous these are, it is still really serious and disturbing. And Helen, Peter, and James specifically point out this issue called idea laundering. It happens in real life in the same way we see it in the film. Absurd academic papers with extreme agendas get peer-reviewed by like-minded scholars and published in ideologically captured journals, making them seem legitimate. Other academics then cite them, creating what they call applied postmodernist power knowledge. Think of it this way. It's not about what's true. It's about who decides what's true. As you can see, this feedback loop can be dangerous, giving extreme and harmful ideas a veneer of legitimacy, with the potential to shape our culture and our understanding of the world.
What appears beyond dispute is that making absurd and horrible ideas sufficiently politically fashionable can get them validated at the highest levels of academic grievance studies.
We rewrote a section of Mein Kampf as intersectional feminism, and this journal has accepted it. Social work.
This is deeply concerning, because the work of grievance scholars goes on to be taught in classes, to design educational curricula, to be taken up by activists, to influence how media is produced, and to misinform journalists and politicians about the true nature of our cultural realities. No one tolerates this sort of corruption when they find out an industry is funding biased research to make itself look a certain way. The same scrutiny should apply to research when it pushes a political agenda. And we have uncovered enough evidence to suggest that this corruption is pervasive among many disciplines, including women's and gender studies, feminist studies, race studies, sexuality studies, fat studies, queer studies, cultural studies, and sociology.
And as Peter said, they're building a new cultural reality, and the goal is to foist that upon you. This isn't scholarship, this is dogma disguised as truth. And the reality is that academia today is not a neutral space. Social justice activists and radical leftists dominate the academy and are being paid well to produce this insanity.
Right, and these things have real consequences. So much of the literature I encountered during my master's program in gender and sexuality studies and global studies was nonsensical. I would read paragraphs that made no sense, trace the sources back 2-3 times, and each time it was just a copy and paste of the same nonsense. I would then finally source it back to the original, which would be like Michel Foucault or another postmodernist, and it would still be incomprehensible. But at that point, you just kind of have to go along to get along and use these crap ideas in order to graduate. It's a system that forces you to regurgitate nonsense in order to succeed. Thank God I was a staff person and got free tuition, but some people actually had to pay for this stuff.
How did you make sense of it, Amelia? I could barely read anything that had to do with Foucault.
Honestly, I didn't. I just assumed I was too dumb to understand, but reading Cynical Theories really changed that for me. Pluckrose and Lindsay explain how these theories aren't just illogical, they're actually harmful when applied in society. Once I understood that, it was seriously like a weight had been lifted. Both the film and the book connect to what they called applied postmodernism. In the book, they show how postmodernism evolved from a philosophy of abstract skepticism into activist scholarship, giving rise to identity-based grievance studies like queer theory, fat studies, disability studies, post-colonial studies, and more. These fields blend postmodern and Marxist ideas using critical theory as their foundation. Once you adopt critical theory, it becomes a framework for creating endless new grievances. Entire academic fields can spin off from the same basic principles. A key feature of critical theory is its focus on breaking down boundaries and blurring lines, reframing traditional norms and categories as not only meaningless, but inherently oppressive. By rejecting these structures outright, critical theory undermines shared social foundations that help people navigate reality. It also treats language as a tool to reshape reality rather than reflect agreed-upon truths, creating a framework where truth becomes subjective and open to manipulation. This approach risks eroding trust and common understanding, leading to division and instability.
The section of the book that discussed queer theory really brought this idea into focus for me on a personal level. Because I remember when the word queer was first introduced to me in college, even though I was active in my high school Gay Straight Alliance as the president during my senior year and before that. I had done research on gay history to highlight our contributions and never encountered the word queer. So as a young gay man, that label was foreign to me. But I was told it was the new identity I should adopt so that I could be trans-inclusive and break away from silos. I didn't understand at that time that this was designed to signal my politics. Gay became what you were labeled within the community, but to the outside world, you're queer. Even though I didn't understand what it meant at that time, I went along with it because I was naive. In college, or as I call them now, indoctrination camps, we were being fed this theory in various ways. So over time, I saw queerness start to meld gender and sexuality into this shapeless, nebulous blob, to the point where straight people began adopting the queer label and wielding authority in our spaces, gay spaces. The worst part was straight men with painted nails or alternative looks being considered part of my community, of which they are not. It all became this strange erosion of identity, self, and at the end, any authentic sense of community. It just started to mean alternative.
Yeah, as someone who's been in lesbian spaces my whole adult life, I can completely relate to that. Even though we were gaining rights, it always felt like this concept of queerness was eating us from within. It completely erased individuality and identity, as you're saying, and turned everything into a collective political statement. Before reading this book, I didn't have the language to explain what was happening, but it really helped me make sense of it. But this erasure isn't just about identity politics. It extends into broader values. The authors explain how critical theory targets universal values like objectivity, meritocracy, and free speech, branding them as oppressive. Take Bret Weinstein, for example. Despite his reputation as a fair and beloved professor, he was forced to bear the symbolic weight of systemic racism and historical wrongs attributed to all white men. His individual actions and character didn't matter. He was reduced to a symbol of oppression. Even his benign opinions were labeled violent, to the point where they were willing to take his job for it. For me, it's clear that all this works to break down the systems that give life shape and stability. Rationality and individuality are replaced with power games and identity politics, And when we lose those foundations, what's left? Just a bunch of little dictators.
Do you know what happened to Brett?
Yes. Well, after the 2017 protests at Evergreen, Brett and his wife Heather, who was also a biology professor there, ended up resigning from their positions. They sued the college, claiming it failed to protect them from the threats and hostility they faced during the protests. The college settled with them out of court, but they had to rebuild their lives from the ground up. Thankfully, they landed on their feet and now host a successful podcast called Dark Horse, where they tackle science and political issues. And that reminds me, I would love to give a quick shout out to Benjamin Boyce, who was a student at Evergreen during the protests and captured much of the footage featured in the Reformers during that time. If you want to explore the full story, visit Benjamin's YouTube page at Benjamin A. Boyce. I seriously spent like 3 days just binging the 100+ videos that he has on this issue. It gets so much more twisted and chaotic and insane than we could even begin to say here.
And it's very uncomfortable to watch. To your point about rationality, I wanted to say what I liked about this book was how it described postmodernism, because it rejects objective truth. You know, as you mentioned, this is a root of critical theory. Instead of knowledge being obtained through rigorous scientific standards like testing, hypotheses, skepticism, knowledge in the postmodern sense is seen as constructed by power structures. According to this framework, power must be redistributed to marginalized groups, and truth becomes distorted to reflect lived experience rather than an objective reality, something we can come to together. This shift has led to a focus on power dynamics over evidence and reason, and it's reshaping how society defines knowledge and justice.
Exactly. It's very Orwellian, and it puts society in a dangerous position. If words and categories lose their meaning and knowledge is based on personal experience rather than measurable facts, people become so much easier to manipulate. You can see this playing out both in the film and in real life. For example, look at the words violence and harm. They've been completely redefined to include things like disagreement, criticism, or even just an acknowledgement of biology. This kind of shift blurs the line between actual oppression and ordinary human interactions, making it easier to control people through guilt and fear. In our group discussions, this book sparked some really interesting points. Some participants shared how anti-racist initiatives in academia or DEI programs in their workplace felt like they were grooming us to be more racist. So even if you weren't racist, these programs seemed to be creating paranoia, resentment, and a sense of divisiveness. What do you think about that, Elías?
Well, it reminds me of something that happened to me in college. So I started taking these type of critical race classes, and an old childhood friend of mine one day told me, I feel like you just hate white people. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't realized that I was being indoctrinated into this anti-racism framework, which to me is another form of racism that is prejudice against white folks and believes in the supremacy of the black and brown races. I mean, you know, it becomes exhausting to look at everything as having a racist motivation. So white people do a benevolent deed, and that's rooted in racism. White people are ignorant, it's racist. And we never get to self-reflect, and we're always pointing out racism one way or the other, even within our own circles. I mean, we should consider whether or not this is a useful framework.
Yeah, this conversation is just making me think about the postmodernist obsession with twisting language and how that played out in real time for both of us. Take, for example, queerness. When we were first exposed to the term, it was presented as this inclusive label for gay and lesbian people. It was framed as a reflection of our good politics and a signal that we were trans-inclusive, whether or not that actually aligned with our sexuality. We were encouraged to adopt it as part of our identity without the ability to really question it. But over time, the term became meaningless, which I now realize was actually by design. It was created to disrupt and erase boundaries by design. And looking back, we were manipulated into embracing something that stripped away a clear sense of identity. It wasn't really about inclusion, it was more about erasure. The same thing happened with the term anti-racism. At first, it seemed simple and clear. Of course, we're against racism, who wouldn't be? But when you dig deeper, the actual meaning is rooted in critical race theory, which revolves around promoting anti-whiteness, division, and even racist stereotypes, as you mentioned. It fosters resentment and suspicion and creates a breakdown of any sense of trust in communities.
And what's wild is that there's research showing how harmful these programs are now, but the left is so defensive about critical race theory that no one is stopping to consider the implications. Like, maybe we shouldn't be pumping this stuff into K-12 schools and in the workplace. Maybe we actually are doing harm instead of good.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it really hits home for me when I think about my time as a student at Hampshire College. I went there for a couple of years. It's an ultra-leftist campus located in Western Massachusetts. I was introduced to the concept of anti-racism there for the first time, and I took it at face value. I would participate in the anti-racism workshops and initiatives because I really thought I was participating in something good. But over time, it felt like I was living in an abusive environment. I was constantly walking on eggshells. I had so much depression and anxiety, and no relationship felt safe because at any time, I felt like anything I said or even thought could be thrown back in my face and held against me. When I was around people of color, I felt this intense pressure to prove that I was the wokest in the room. And when I came across white people, I had this intense hostility towards them. And honestly, that hostility was rewarded. The more I could perform my disdain for white people, the more accepted I was by people of color. And as I'm saying all of this, I'm not pointing fingers. I was as much a victim of this stuff as I was a perpetrator. I feel like that's how it functions. The teachers are teaching the students, and then the students imbibe it and act it out. They grow up, and then they teach the next cycle. And that happens whether you become a faculty person or whether you are an artist or whether you are someone who does programming or even community organizing. We learn it and then we pass it on because that's how the transmission of culture works, right? It's all about learning it and passing it on. And especially when you think that the thing that you're learning is about social progression and improving things for the better, it's extremely important to embody it and pass it on. So when we're talking about all this stuff, I just want to emphasize that we're not pointing fingers only. This group and the purpose of this podcast is to practice for ourselves and hopefully with other people, self-accountability, self-reflection, and growth through that practice. Well, anyways, I just noticed that it was just giving me such a cynical, ugly perception of the world. And honestly, I thought that that was just life and I had to adapt to it. And the sad thing is I actually did. I created a really successful life within that worldview. But I was miserable. And it's really been through this process of re-educating myself, exploring these lectures and books that everyone told me to avoid and to not listen to, that I finally feel myself healing and changing and letting this stuff go. And going on that journey has been wonderful in many ways, but also very, very scary.
In many ways, very scary. You were totally right. I can totally relate to that. You know, I remember being afraid to even be attracted to white people at some point, even though that's who I was primarily attracted to and surrounded by in high school. You know, that's where it really took over my sexuality a bit, and I feel frustrated by that because I couldn't enjoy people for who they were. They had to be black or brown and politically queer. These were barriers I imposed onto my own life, my own dating life, because of this perception I was having of the world. To me, a good person had to be in a pro-black relationship, whatever that meant, in order to promote black-on-black love, which is not seen, you know. Otherwise, I would face social scrutiny, especially as a Caribbean Dominican American. That mindset prevented me from making, you know, deep emotional connections. I remember specifically certain emotional relationships could only go so far because of my commitment to this race-obsessed culture.
Yes, absolutely. The more I think about it, the more I realize it preys on insecurities we already have. For me as a biracial Black woman, it tapped into the deep-seated traumas I grew up with around my identity. It constantly reinforced this feeling that I had to prove myself all of the time. It also fed into some resentments I had with my white family, especially my dad. We were really close, but he ended up dying of a drug overdose, which left me with a lot of anger. That anger obviously went way beyond race, but This ideology gave me a way to channel it through race, which I now realize was probably a lot easier to deal with than the actual pain of his addiction. Anyways, a real turning point for me was when I saw this video that was going viral a couple years ago of a mixed-race woman, probably in her 20s, speaking at her father's funeral. I actually have the eulogy here so I can get the quote right. She says, and I quote, "Dad, I'm grateful for all you gave this family, but I don't miss you.
When you died, I felt like there was a hole. I missed something, but it wasn't you. It was the idea of what you could become. I miss being able to hope and wish that one day you turn a corner and see the world from my perspective. I miss the idea that one day you might help me fight for the things that matter. I missed my fantasy of you. Because when you died, it solidified the fact that you'll never be what you could have been, but only what you are. And what you are is a racist, misogynistic, xenophobic, Trump-loving, cis-straight white man. That is all you will ever be to me. And Dad, before you tell me to respect the dead, please remember that you disrespected and disregarded the lives and deaths of entire communities of people with your ideology. You told me to never back down, so I won't. You know for a fact that even against you, I'm not afraid to share my peace. You are everything I aspire not to be, and I refuse to stand up here and sing the praises of a man who is the paradigm of white supremacy. So I'll take your racist mindset, I'll take your money, and I'll take your advice. And I swear to God I will make this world a better place. Not at all because of you, but in exact opposition to you."
End quote. As you listen to it, you can't help but just draw back in your seat in shock and horror. And you can see in the audience, like literally that's the response from everyone as well. And it was scary to watch because of what it showed me of the culture that I was participating in. I feel like she perfectly embodies the ideas we're talking about here. From what I can tell, she had a tremendous amount of guilt and shame over her half-whiteness, which drove her to cast her father as the villain. And she was so desperate to do that, she was willing to dehumanize him as he lay in his casket, at his own funeral, in front of his grieving loved ones. Honestly, it was like watching someone in a cult.
That's because she's in a cult. Let's think about that for a minute. Under what circumstance would anyone ever do this? It's like a shame and disowning ritual, which reminds me of so many other cult stories. That was just so insane that I actually did some research. And I found out the girl's father was a billionaire named Donald Foss. He died of cancer. The daughter, who you guessed it, identifies as non-binary and uses they-them pronouns, also identifies as, surprise, a black supremacist. Meanwhile, her father, whom she accused of being a white supremacist, was a philanthropist who awarded 630 scholarships to students in need. And I wonder, what is she materially giving to people?
Wow, I didn't even realize those things initially. That's interesting. That definitely puts things into more context and sort of makes it all a little bit more cringe, but even though I wasn't that far gone, I still see how this ideology preyed on the same insecurities I've struggled with. I feel like it's so important for all of us to stay mindful of the pre-existing traumas and psychological wounds we have, both individually and as a society, so we can better recognize how easily these frameworks can manipulate and exploit us. I just hope she can forgive herself one day when she's finally out of this. Anyways, okay, so back to the group discussion. One participant brought up the idea of leftist overreach. She said, "We're often made to feel like we owe a moral debt to the past, which leads us to exaggerate harm or even outright lie to justify extreme solutions. It's a form of overcompensating in an attempt to create some kind of utopian balance." I've definitely seen this in activist spaces. People exaggerating or even fabricating stories of victimization, and sometimes even crossing legal lines, all in the name of the greater good. I've even had private conversations with friends where I've pointed out how a new cause is actually problematic or doesn't make any sense, only for them to give me quiet agreement on one hand, while on the other, actively telling me to shush up so that people don't realize that I am crossing the party line. In those moments, it's completely transparent that it's more important for them to honor the doctrine than to have any semblance of integrity.
The willingness to manipulate truth for ideology is like deeply unsettling. I mean, I'm someone who believes in honesty and transparency. You can never go wrong with that. The key to life, in my opinion, is just to be upfront and for real. But this ideology is somewhat designed to be insidious, in my opinion. It has you so often convinced by tailored facts. People only give you part of the story, or they reframe the narrative to fit a specific agenda, and it's hard to know what's right. You don't even know what questions to ask. But I've learned that the more questions you ask, the more holes you poke in their logic. Unfortunately, most of the time, you trust leadership, groupthink, and this concept of social justice. You don't question anything else. There's this hyper focus on victimhood. You never stop to think how the victim contributes to the outcomes of their situations. Not to go too deep into specific examples, but I think there's a very troubling aspect of leftist culture here. There's always a slant. Questioning tactics, as I did in certain circles and as you did, often leads to being ousted or canceled. That is a telltale sign of corruption, cult-like ideology, and authoritarianism. Ironically, the very things we're supposed to be fighting against. It's an interesting dilemma.
So with all of that being said, I'm really excited about the next segment of The Mirror, which is going to explore the theme, the roots and fruits of Marxism. What are your thoughts on that, Elías? I feel like it's a really important subject because so many of us have been impacted by Marxism and are affected by it, but actually don't know anything about it.
I really like thinking about Marxism because it was my baptism into radical leftist culture. That's where it fully clicked for me. At some point, critical race and critical queer theory were there too, but it didn't take root in my heart, as deeply as Marxism did. And the group I was in, a Marxist group that was, led by an affiliated communist member party, the top of the top, that really shaped my experience. I was reading a ton of Marxist texts. It was pretty much the only thing I was reading for a couple years. I was reading Eric Williams, Walter Rodney, Steele R. James, because I was deeply invested in their perspectives and how they applied Marxism with a Black point of view. So much so, I was so invested in this that I actually went back to Temple University, my alma mater, for a master's in history. But while I was in there, I quickly realized I was fully a Marxist. I hadn't thought of that as me before. I just assumed it was the way the world worked. But as I was going through each class, I started questioning myself. People were saying economics isn't the most important aspect to look at. And I'd be like, wait, it isn't? Is that not the root of everything? And that realization was the beginning of my unraveling. It's one of the reasons I didn't continue the program, because it had dawned on me that my ideas were not necessarily my own.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this segment because I've always had so many unanswered questions about Marxism and communism. Honestly, I used to think people who openly supported and identified as communists were kind of ridiculous because it's like, how could you support something that led to the deaths of 100 million people over the last century? But it has seriously captured the minds of so many people I know, and I never could really understand why. Finally getting a chance to educate myself on the subject is making me realize how much of Marxism has actually impacted my worldview and how much of it I've actually adopted in my beliefs about the world and even myself. It also just feels so timely because Marxism has influenced so many modern movements like Black Lives Matter, queer culture, and Antifa, so many things. This is a great chance to dive into the history that most of us were never taught and explore ideas that are actively being suppressed, like debates around cultural Marxism, which some argue has led to the modern social justice movement. And let me just say this. If you disagree with the facts that are being presented, the arguments that are being presented, that is totally fine. We welcome that. Just come ready to debate the ideas. If instead you want to attack the character or personalities of the thinkers that we're going to be exploring, then don't bother joining the conversation because that is exactly the culture we're trying to change. The point of the group is to challenge ourselves by listening to voices we've been told to avoid. I mean, think about that for a minute. We are constantly told to not read a certain author because they are evil, due to a tweet or something they said or how they voted. And if you have the balls to actually read their work, you're then a Nazi by proxy. Who gets to decide what ideas we're allowed to explore?
I mean, that's really the question. I mean, who is to say don't listen to this person, they are evil? The truth is, people lie. And the reason the left doesn't want you to research or think critically outside of their bubble is because you'll start seeing the cracks. As someone who was a full-on leftist, I've come to understand these ideas are manipulative. I've seen it firsthand. Leaders lying and dealing with contradictions through shame and excommunication. This doesn't deserve praise or loyalty. This is why I think the Marxism discussion is so necessary. Leftists truly don't comprehend how deeply it's embedded in their worldview. It influences what they think, what they think they deserve, what they think that they want. And their entire perspective on life is controlled by this framework. So as we go through these discussions, I want people who may be in that mindset to ask yourself, why does this make you uncomfortable if it's not true? Anyways, Amelia, let's talk about the actual material we're going to be discussing next episode.
To ground the conversation, we're reading The Devil and Karl Marx by Paul Kanger. The book explores the history and application of Marxist ideology through the archetype of the devil. It delves into who Marx was as a person and how his ideas, when put into practice, have led to so much turmoil. I loved this book. It really took me for a ride. It is super dark, so be warned. It is very, very intense. After reading it, I remember just feeling dumbfounded and just like, I wanted to kick myself for not knowing so much about the world, for not knowing so much really, really important critical information that I think we all should know. So I'm really, really excited for the discussion we're going to have for that is scheduled for December 15th.
A quick disclaimer. This book comes from a pro-Christian, pro-religion perspective. You don't have to be religious to respect the facts. This book highlights how the Christian church was a primary target of communist persecution and reveals the tactics of communists and socialists. It's a crucial lens for understanding Marxism's broader impact.
In addition, we will be looking at a mix of interviews, speeches, and lectures. The first video is a lecture by James Lindsay called The Historical and Cultural History of Marxism. It traces Marxism's evolution from an economic theory into cultural Marxism, looking at how it has infiltrated academia and reshaped Western culture. Many other people share this perspective, but he is one of the foremost thinkers on it.
And this is the same James Lindsay from Cynical Theories.
Yeah, since we already introduced him through the film and book, which were produced several years ago, I think this recent lecture is a great opportunity to see how his research and thinking on these issues has evolved. Interestingly, the Southern Poverty Law Center, a left-wing legal advocacy nonprofit I used to respect, put him on a watch list. They essentially smeared him as an anti-Semitic right-wing conspiracy theorist, specifically because of his work around cultural Marxism. Ironically, he's a liberal, clearly not anti-Semitic, and his work is rooted in detailed research, hardly the stuff of conspiracy theories. So these smear campaigns are extremely suspicious, to say the least, and for me shows how propagandistic any institution can become. It's important to say, once again, that in this group we focus on exploring ideas from a range of perspectives, without idolizing any one intellectual. Nobody is perfect, but we don't believe in dismissing someone just because we disagree with something they've said or done. What matters to me is the strength of their arguments and the accuracy of their facts. Is it true? If it is, their personal lives don't matter to me.
Yeah, and to add another point, one of the documentaries we'll be discussing shows the realities of socialism versus its theory. So that's where most people spend most of their time in theory. This points to the real-world struggles of socialist countries and why they broke away from socialism in order to improve their conditions. If it's difficult to watch, I encourage you to sit with that discomfort and understand why sharing this truth is so important. We'll be sharing supplemental videos that feature first-hand accounts of people who survived the fruits of Marxism, like communism in North Korea, China, the Soviet Union, and Latin America. I know that's going to be a mental struggle for some people, for most people really, but if you uphold this idea that people's stories are more important than facts, if you're still there, if you are about believing victims and all of these social justice tenets, you should ask yourself, why you don't want to believe defectors, or why you're resistant to the stories of the people who have actually lived through it, just because it goes against your beliefs. Think about that just for a second. Why are you resisting when in any other instance, if it supports your point of view, you would look to these people as prime examples and heroes in some respects?
Exactly. And let's be real, we've already had some pushback because some of these survivors, people who have endured human trafficking, starvation, and unimaginable hardships, have shared their testimonies at conferences organized by conservatives. But here's the thing, they're speaking on those platforms because leftists refuse to give them a voice. Their experiences are dismissed outright, not because they aren't valid, but because they contradict the left's narratives. If you're tired of that, if you're ready to challenge yourself with new information and engage with a thoughtful, open-minded group of people who are doing the same, we'd love to have you join us in the discussion group. And either way, we invite you to keep listening. Bye!